Okay, so we've made it to good old Darwin and Wallace, natural selection, variational evolution, which is super important to us because remember, it overturns the idea of essentialism or unchanging creatures that was the basis for the great chain of being. And it'd be lovely to leave it there as Darwin, the hero who helps us understand all these things, and now we can think differently about the world. But it actually didn't, the great chain of being didn't go away that quickly. It's a very powerful idea, and it has a lot to do with our beliefs about our own perfectibility, where the world is headed, what kind of creatures we are, the human's place in the world, the role of divine and the people's relationship with non-human animals. And so a lot of what happened, not necessarily because of Darwin, although he did contribute to some of this with another book called The Descent of Man, which is not as well read for good reasons as the Origin of Species. But the idea was that in some ways, human beings, especially in the old days, man was thought to be at the top or the pinnacle, the most perfect of creation, but in evolutionary terms, the most perfect creature that everything else was striving to. And so that the idea was that people evolved from the lower animals, but just like in the chain of being, everything was organized on this ascending line of perfectibility. So a lot of what the old ideas about hierarchy, progressive evolution, and change were imported into the way people thought about evolution. And it's an idea that stays with us to this day. It's very difficult to convince people that evolution doesn't make things better and better and better. We often link in our minds progress with evolution. And the reason we do that, or one of the reasons we do that, is because in some ways our underlying idea is still that there are these links to be joined up in the great chain of being, and that everything is trying to be more perfect and more like the top of the chain. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the actual mechanisms of human evolution, but a lot of people are always looking for the missing link. And the idea of a missing link comes to us actually from this idea of a great chain of being, that everything has to be connected. We now know that we are not looking for missing links, we are looking for common ancestors, which is a quite different enterprise. And so the search for missing links has actually taken us in a wrong direction, evolutionarily speaking. But it has to do with this idea that was imported to us during this time, that there is still a hierarchy of the natural world, and evolution is simply joining it up together. So part of this, again, we wanted to make Darwin into a good person here, but part of it was some phrasings or language that Darwin borrowed from the sociologist Herbert Spencer. And so, as I said, in his original writings, Darwin didn't talk much about evolution, and he actually didn't use the phrase to which most people think about him for as survival of the fittest. He preferred the phrase descent with modification. But after doing some other reading, he imported this other phrase that came to us from Spencer, which Spencer meant to describe human life, actually, and then attributed it to all of the natural world, the idea of survival of the fittest. A lot of people think that this may have been a mistake on Darwin's part, in the sense that it helps to enshrine some very wrong ideas about how evolution works. And right at the beginning, before we even get into the developments in evolutionary thought, which we'll talk about the extended evolutionary synthesis, we can already say that in evolutionary terms, there's no such thing as an absolute measure of fitness. In evolutionary terms, fitness is simply reproductive, the differential in reproduction. And so what is fit in one environment, what is adaptive for one environment, may become maladaptive in another environment. And we also know that the environment is always changing. I mean, it stays the same over some years, but it's changing. And so times change, and so does fitness. And so this idea that we could measure and say that a creature is absolutely fit doesn't actually work for how the evolutionary process unfolds. The other interesting thing that Lavenda and Schultz talked to us about here, borrowing a concept from Stephen Jay Gould, is that natural selection is usually shown as a process of adaptation, of traits adapting to an environment. But the problem is that if we only look at adaptation, it can't explain a lot of the traits that developed in living creatures. And one of the best examples is the trait of wings, or being able to fly. There's no way you get to wings by a process of natural selection, because you can't have an offspring. If I start trying to flap, and then I'm hoping that my offspring are going to have a little bit longer arms and a little bit more flappiness, we'll never get there. It can't work through natural variation. This is why some biologists have proposed this idea of exaptation, which is that a trait will adapt for one environment, but will then allow the organism to exploit an entirely different characteristic or an entirely different niche. And so with wings, some of the common explanations for things like how insects fly is that these appendages developed perhaps to cool the body. And so they had a natural selection process by which they were getting longer. And then as flight began, then a different process of natural selection took over to adapt them to the new environment. And this is what they call exaptation, where a trait that was developed for natural selection in one environment becomes useful in a very different or changed environment. Like I said, there's a number of things about the world that simply don't make sense if you're only gradually trying to adapt to an environment. The other thing that happens is that when Darwin was proposing his ideas of natural selection, people didn't know, at least in Darwin's corner of the world, how inheritance worked. And so they had this idea, they knew that the offspring were kind of like their parents, but they thought it was kind of like paint blending together. So if you had red and white paint, then you got pink paint. And this was called pangenesis, or blended inheritance. And so people knew that, again, that offspring were like their parents and that there was variation, but they didn't know how traits were inherited. This is where Gregor Mendel, he's off in a monastery and he's growing his pea plants. You've probably all had to do those Punnett squares with the big T and the little t and the recessive and the dominant. And perhaps you've wondered why you're doing that or why it matters, except to get that Punnett square grade. The reason Mendel's work was so important is that if inheritance comes as these individual units, which can be independently assorted, recombined, stay dormant in one generation and then come out in another generation, then it amplifies this process of variation, diversity, upon which evolution can work. If inheritance worked like Darwin thought, blended inheritance or pangenesis, the variation would wash out because you'd just be blended together. Every time you crossed tall pea plants and short pea plants, you'd get medium pea plants to the point that they'd all be medium with light yellow flowers. So what Mendel was proving there, and what would eventually become the basis of genetics, is that this variation came in a very different way than what Darwin believed. Now, Darwin lived and died in about the same time as Mendel, and Mendel lived and died about the same time as Darwin, and Darwin's in London doing his thing, and Mendel's in his monastery doing his thing, and their paths never crossed. This was not a time where you could search for different people's scientific papers. They never published together, they never read each other's work. Later on, after they died, and especially in the 1940s and 1950s, people combined the natural selection ideas of Darwin with the genetic ideas of Mendel to come up with what is called the modern evolutionary synthesis. It's sometimes also called neo-Darwinian evolution, new Darwinian evolution, but it basically combines the genetics with the natural selection ideas. And it's been a hugely important idea. The importance of the modern evolutionary synthesis cannot really be overemphasized. And it's what we learn for the most part in our high schools, and for the most part in Johnstone as well. So hugely important idea, and it's extremely important today. We do know, though, that the ideas that those pea plants and the tall and the short peas that were controlled by one gene, Mendelian genetics, especially on human beings, is pretty simplistic. And so there are some things that people thought were very Mendelian, like eye color, which turned out to be regulated by a number of different genes. And so right in the middle of this chapter, from about pages 45 to 55, the chapter gets really complicated. And for those of you who are able to tackle that stuff, makes me happy. But we're not going to concentrate too much on the details of everything that happens in genetics. That's a different kind of, you can take other classes in that. For our purposes, I'll just say genetics is very complex. It's a lot more complicated than the one gene, one trait model, or that certain genes produce certain traits. In human beings especially, we have what is called polygenic inheritance, which means many of our characteristics are influenced by multiple genes, which then combine to create one phenotype or one observable characteristic. And so this is true, and it will be important for when we talk about the concept of race biologically, that human skin color is the product of many different genes. And if we look at that picture on page 50 of Lavenda and Schultz, we can see that there isn't just, that human skin color varies gradually across a population, so that there's no lines at which you draw and say it's a gradual change, all because of, basically because of this polygenic inheritance. So there's not just a limited number of skin types. We go from the darkest to the lightest, you might say, and everything in between. And there's no boundaries or variation biologically where you can make a clean cut between those things. The other thing that we know now, we often think, for example, of mutations as something that happens once and you're done. at the birth process or at the fertilization process. But we know now that genes are constantly themselves changing. That as the environment changes and as organisms develop, genes are turning on and off. Genes in our bodies are mutating as we speak. And so genes are in constant interaction within our organism and within our environment. And we're finding out more and more about what is called epigenetics, or the switches or the stuff that can turn on and off certain genes and can be inherited in different ways than simply genetic inheritance. And so again, this is a hugely complex and developing field in biology. We're not going to go through every detail. We're just going to concentrate on the part of how lively and dynamic and complex we've figured out that this is. There are some biologists who have started to argue in the last 10 to 20 years. So if the modern evolutionary synthesis comes to us, say, from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, maybe this is something that's come to us in the last 20 to 30 years, the idea that we can build upon what is called the modern evolutionary synthesis and have what is called an expanded evolutionary synthesis or an extended evolutionary synthesis. Now, some of this stuff is still quite up for debate among the biologists. It might be a little bit out there and people have questioned to what extent these processes apply. But for this class, they're very important because they're very important for human evolution. So the one that Lavenda and Schultz emphasize, and we're going to be taking a look at in more depth of this idea of the extended evolutionary synthesis, is the idea of niche construction. So niche construction posits 2 points. The first, what we've seen already before, is that our genetics are dynamic. They are changing. They change in response to environmental conditions. They change in the organism as it develops. But then we have the point that organisms, as they are being alive and doing their thing, are altering the environment. And so we are born into an environment which is shaped by our forebears, by the past generation, but we also take action within that environment to change it for the next generation and for our own lives. Now, this happens in a lot of different creatures, perhaps all creatures, but some examples are very obvious. Beaver dams and lodges, which changed the landscape, reshaped actually in the places where the beaver were prevalent in the Americas, really reshaped the whole natural environment, but also birds' nests and rodent holes and even algae transforms its environment. A lot of these things might be unintentional, so that over time, algae and bacteria are breaking down and changing the environment. But the point of the matter is that either intentionally or unintentionally, it can be the case that the alterations that we make, those ways in which we construct niches, can change the conditions under which the next generation is selected. So if you think about the things that make us able to survive a room like this, as opposed to the conditions under which we may have been trying to study 100 years ago, it is obvious that we have modified quite a bit the conditions of selection of the next generation of human beings. It doesn't matter to us as much that we need to be strong and robust and able to chop wood as much as we used to perhaps have to. So in all creatures, though, it can potentially alter your conditions of selection, these intentional and unintentional environmental changes. And that's where we have a second crucial meeting point about why anthropology and evolution are sort of in interaction, because Lavenda and Schultz bring up this term of human agency. And by that, they mean the ability of people to change things in their personal lives or collectively in their environment. That we are not simply automatons or robots, that we think about things and try to make things different than they are. So we might migrate or move to a different place. Or we might do this, we might change the environment, we might deliberately alter it. Or we might come up with ideas about who we should marry and who we should mate with, which might be quite different from straight up natural selection ideals. So there's not necessarily a natural selection advantage to having a certain color of eyes, but those can be attractive to people, and that can change the evolutionary process. And we know that nests and beaver dams and those things are great, but perhaps more than any other organism, humans are really good at creating niches to live in. And we modify our environments tremendously, and we make them flat, and we put carpets down, and we do all these things in order to change the conditions, which will then result in different kinds of people being favored to live in this altered environment. And so simply applying a natural selection kind of survival of the fittest model to human beings is especially difficult. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Evolution is still happening, it's still occurring. We have not outgrown evolution, or evolution has not stopped. But it's simply that there's going to be a lot of, especially when it comes to human beings, there's going to be a lot of influences of what people do and how people think about the world and how they react to different kinds of changes, and the way we try to change things with, say, technology. That many of us are able to see things and to maneuver in the world, whereas a few hundred years ago, it would not have been that easy to see things if our eyes were, at least mine, if my eyes had been as bad and were not corrected through contact lenses or glasses. So we alter our environments, making natural selection. Again, it doesn't go away. It's still operative, and the evolutionary processes are still operative, but they're often much more complex because of human activity, human technologies, and human agency. So we can finally, I hope, say goodbye or try to understand the power of how important it has been as a big idea in the world, this idea of the great chain of being and perfectibility. But it is time to say goodbye to it at last. And so to do that, we have to understand that evolution isn't just things getting better and better and better. We're always going to be in a changing environment. We're always going to be interacting with other organisms in that environment, which may have their own ideas about niche construction. Rodents might be doing some niche construction in your house and altering that house environment in ways that you don't like. We also know that what is adaptive, but there's no measure of absolute fitness. What is adaptive in one environment might become maladaptive in another environment. And so what this means is that if we were to rewind the tape of evolution and start with slightly different conditions, or some random stuff might not have happened, or that asteroid wouldn't have come down and changed the climate for the poor dinosaurs, that it wasn't inevitable that human beings were going to emerge from this process. We are not actually at the center of the evolutionary story, as Lavenda and Schultz put it. We're not at a pinnacle which the world revolves around us because all kinds of creatures are trying to do their thing. We got lucky for a while. The other thing is that evolution doesn't always, as I would put it, doesn't always work. And I don't mean that it's not working. Of course, the process of evolution is happening. But what I mean is as the environment changes, that doesn't mean you automatically get the trait you need to survive. Most of the time, if you are very nicely adapted to an environment and that environment changes, that species will go extinct. So that, as Lewontin says in Lavenda and Schultz at the very end on page 58, if we look back over the stretch of evolutionary time, he estimates that 99.999% of the species that once existed are no longer with us. I'm not sure if it's 99.99 or 9, but it's a lot. Most creatures don't make it, and it's still life proliferates and goes on, which is to say, again, just because natural selection occurs, when the environment changes, it doesn't mean you can call up the trait that is needed to survive. Sometimes it'll appear, and sometimes it won't. And so evolution is not, again, it isn't an inevitable path that leads us from simple organisms to complex organisms. Sometimes organisms do get more complex. We can measure that in various ways, but sometimes they evolve back to being simpler. And sometimes it's better to be a simpler organism because as the environment changes, you aren't adapted to a unique environment and you can be more flexible and adaptive that way. So there's nothing built in to the process of natural selection which makes things more complicated. It is certain that organisms might get more complicated over time, but that's randomness. That's because we start out with single-celled organisms, which are still the best organisms, evolutionarily speaking. There's way more bacteria than there is of anything else. But over time, you're going to see different configurations emerge, but there's no necessary route from simple to complex here. And so if we want to think about this, Lavenda and Schultz give us a great picture. It's actually based on an earlier work, another text, about how we've modified the ideas of evolution. So this is on page 58. If you see as the core of this, what we're talking about with Darwin and Wallace, variation, inheritance, and natural selection. So that's our core here. And then we move out once we get Mendel and some of the genetic stuff. If you take this lighter shaded, larger area, you have what we might call the modern evolutionary synthesis. And then in this other area are those things that are still being developed. Like I said, they're a little more controversial. And we've focused for the most part on niche construction. We've talked a tiny bit about epigenetic inheritance. We won't talk about some of these other things that much, but these are the things that people are working on in a way to try and figure out if these are viable ideas in biology. Like I said, some of them are a little bit controversial and somewhat debated. But the point of the matter is, and this is in their summary statement on page 60, is that studying evolution in biology today is a very lively thing. It's an ongoing process. As we talked about with the theory of evolution, it's a fruitful field for a lot of different research. In anthropology, we are interested in these ideas of niche construction because it talks to us about how human organisms, as we became human, transformed our environments in ways that had really never been seen before on this planet, and perhaps are quite strange. And we can also use this to think about our world today. which is that human beings are transforming not only their local environments, creating rooms like this one and buildings like this one and houses like this one, but all over the world, human beings are reshaping the world through their activity. And Lavenda and Schultz introduce us to this idea of the Anthropocene, which some geologists and others have proposed as this era in which human activity becomes the predominant driving force of what used to be the natural world. So in the other eras, we might say that there are that human beings were, or that human, well, in many of the eras, humans weren't even around. But for a very long time, human beings were around, but they weren't a huge force globally. But we've now entered the point where with our production of plastics and other materials, we are transforming the entire globe or the entire environment and changing not only our physical environment, but the climate as well. And so this is why I think, again, it's important for us to realize some of the flaws in the great chain of being idea if we are to diagnose where we are going as human beings. And so understanding the consequences of how human niche construction is going to be a hugely important task if we are to survive our own environmental modifications, if we are to figure out how to create more sustainable structures that will not be as transformative as the kinds of things that seem to give us weird snowstorms in Texas. So that's where that's hopefully part of evolution, which we can then take into our present and into our future. Questions?